In 2017, Kenya opened its fastest railway, linking the port city of Mombasa with the capital, Nairobi. A trip that once took 10-12 hours by road dropped to about 4 hours by train, while freight began moving much faster. But the project was about more than speed. Built with Chinese financing and engineering, it became one of East Africa's biggest infrastructure projects and raised a key question: would it boost the region's economy or create long-term debt risks for Kenya? The transport challenge in East Africa. East Africa depends heavily on one crucial gateway to the global economy: the Port of Mombasa. Located along Kenya's Indian Ocean coastline, the port handles cargo arriving from Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. From there, goods move inland not only to Kenya, but also to several landlocked countries, including Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan, and parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. For these nations, Mombasa is more than just a shipping port, it is a lifeline for international trade. Nearly everything from fuel and machinery to food supplies passes through this single gateway. For decades, however, transporting cargo from the port to inland markets was slow and expensive. The majority of freight traveled by truck along the busy Mombasa-Nairobi highway. Every day, thousands of trucks filled the road, creating long traffic jams and increasing the risk of accidents. High fuel costs and delays pushed transportation prices higher, making trade less efficient. Kenya did technically have a railway system. The original line had been built by the British colonial administration in 1901. However, that railway used narrow gauge tracks and aging locomotives. Trains were slow, unreliable, and frequently broke down. Moving freight between Mombasa and Nairobi could take 2 days or even longer. By the early 2000s, Kenya's economy was expanding rapidly. Trade volumes were growing, and the country needed a faster and more efficient transportation system to keep up. The government began exploring the idea of building a modern standard gauge railway capable of carrying heavy cargo at higher speeds. Western financial institutions studied the proposal but hesitated. The project required billions of dollars in investment, and the expected financial returns were uncertain. Eventually, China stepped forward with a financing package and construction plan that allowed the project to move forward. Building one of Africa's largest rail projects. The railway that emerged from this partnership became known as the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway. The line runs approximately 472 kilometers between the coastal city of Mombasa and Nairobi. Later, Kenya extended the railway another 120 kilometers inland to Naivasha, creating an important inland cargo hub. Together, these projects cost close to $5 billion. Construction was led by the Chinese engineering firm China Road and Bridge Corporation, while most of the funding came from loans provided by the Export-Import Bank of China, which financed roughly 90% of the project. Passenger trains began operating in 2017, and freight services followed soon afterward. Unlike the old colonial railway, the new system uses standard gauge track, which allows trains to carry heavier loads and operate at higher speeds. Modern diesel-electric locomotives power the trains, enabling passenger services to reach speeds of around 120 kilometers per hour. This upgrade dramatically reduced travel time between Mombasa and Nairobi. A journey that once took most of a day could now be completed in roughly 4 hours. Kenya named the passenger service the Madaraka Express, honoring the country's independence celebrations. Modern stations were built in both major cities, along with several towns along the route. Maintenance depots, cargo terminals, and rail yards were also constructed as part of the system. How construction happened so quickly? One of the most remarkable aspects of the railway project was how fast it was completed. Building nearly 600 kilometers of railway in just 3 years is unusual for a project of this scale. The speed came largely from the way construction was organized. At the peak of the project, more than 25,000 workers were involved in construction. Engineers, machine operators, surveyors, and safety teams worked simultaneously across multiple sections of the railway rather than building the line gradually from one end to the other. Large amounts of heavy construction equipment were brought in, and many bridge components and rail segments were manufactured in advance. This allowed crews to install track rapidly once land preparation had been completed. This assembly line approach reflects a construction method frequently used in China, where thousands of kilometers of rail infrastructure have been built during the past 2 decades. However, the project still faced serious engineering challenges. Part of the railway route passes through Tsavo National Park, one of the largest wildlife reserves in Africa. Engineers had to design special elevated bridges and wildlife crossings to allow animals such as elephants, giraffes, and antelope to pass safely beneath the tracks. In total, the railway required dozens of large bridges, hundreds of smaller drainage structures, and multiple viaducts spanning valleys and rivers. Another reason construction progressed quickly was the project's financing structure. Because the Chinese loan was directly tied to construction, the stages of planning, financing, approval, and building occurred simultaneously rather than sequentially. In many countries, these phases can take years to complete individually. Economic effects of the railway. The main purpose of any railway is to move goods efficiently. In Kenya's case, early economic indicators showed measurable improvements. Before the SGR was built, transporting a shipping container from Mombasa to Nairobi by truck could cost around $1,000, depending on fuel prices and road conditions. Freight carried by train reduced these costs by approximately 30 to 40%, particularly for bulk cargo. Freight trains are capable of transporting hundreds of containers in a single journey, which reduces congestion on highways and lowers fuel consumption. Fewer trucks on the road also means fewer accidents and less environmental impact. The construction phase itself also generated significant economic activity. Between 40,000 and 46,000 local jobs were created during the project. Kenyan technicians received training in railway operations, signaling systems, and equipment maintenance. Beyond direct employment, the project stimulated demand across other sectors of the economy. Cement factories, steel manufacturers, transport companies, and service providers all benefited from the surge in infrastructure spending. During the years surrounding construction, Kenya's economic growth remained around 5% annually, supported partly by large-scale infrastructure investment. The debt debate. Despite its benefits, the railway has sparked debate mainly because of the loans used to fund it. Around 90% of the project was financed through borrowing, meaning Kenya must repay the debt over many years using railway revenue and public funds. Supporters argue that borrowing for infrastructure is common worldwide, as many highways, ports, and railways in developed countries were also built using public debt. Critics, however, note that Kenya's national debt rose from about 42% of GDP in 2013 to over 60% within a few years, with the railway being one of the largest investments during that period. Some economists also question whether freight demand was overestimated. If cargo volumes remain lower than expected, the railway may struggle to generate enough revenue to cover loan repayments. Rumors once claimed China could take control of the port of Mombasa if Kenya defaulted, but no evidence supports this claim, and Kenyan officials have denied such provisions exist. The debate highlights a broader challenge for developing countries, financing major infrastructure projects that may take decades to deliver full economic returns. The vision of a regional rail network. The Mombasa-Nairobi Railway was never intended to remain a single isolated line. From the beginning, planners envisioned a much larger regional network. The long-term goal was to extend the railway westward into Uganda and potentially onward to Rwanda, South Sudan, and eastern parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Such a network would dramatically reduce transportation costs for landlocked countries that currently depend on road transport to reach the sea. Faster rail connections could make exports more competitive and encourage industrial development across the region. Kenya also began developing inland dry ports near Naivasha, where cargo can be transferred between trains and trucks or future railway connections. However, the expansion has slowed in recent years. Uganda temporarily paused construction of its planned railway segment after reviewing project costs, and financing has become more difficult as debt levels across many African countries have increased. Without cross-border rail connections, freight volumes remain lower than originally projected. A mixed but important result. The standard gauge railway has significantly improved transportation in Kenya. Travel between Mombasa and Nairobi is faster and more reliable, freight costs have fallen, and pressure on major highways has eased. However, its wider impact depends on whether the railway eventually expands across East Africa. For now, the project stands as a major engineering achievement and a reminder that large infrastructure investments can bring both economic opportunities and financial challenges. What do you think? Will this railway transform East Africa's economy, or could the debt risks be too high? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.